Ayes have it. Clerk.
Executive Business Order of the Day number 2, Education Amendment Bill 2017, resumption of debate on the question that this bill be agreed to in principle.
The question is the bill will be agreed to in principle. Mr Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak to this bill in the absence of Ms Lee today, but it is fitting that it was me as the Shadow Minister some 2+ years ago that adjourned this bill on its presentation. The bill was introduced in October 2017 and was designed to produce 3 major objectives. Firstly, to restrict the eligibility of ACT home education registration to those who live in the ACT. And secondly, to provide for further restrictions and qualifications to be required through regulations. These are abundantly fine, and although the devil is in the detail, the opposition will be supporting these amendments that have been circulated by the Minister. The third major goal of the bill is to do away with provisional registration under the Act as it stands. The fundamental is that the grant of provisional registration is non-discretionary. Further, whether it is due to a flaw in the drafting or not, there is the possibility of a child being perpetually re-registered for provisional home education without any oversight from the Education Directorate. This clearly is not a sound policy position and may be open to being misused. We admit that the possibility of a child's registration being in some kind of a recursive loop is problematic. This is far from unsolvable, and in our opinion, could have been dealt with other than the complete abolition of this provision. The government has, however, chosen to abolish the provision of home registration, abolish provisional home registration in its entirety. Regardless, though, throughout our consultation on this bill, home educators have repeatedly raised this change as a major concern. They are concerned that, considering the limited consultation they have had prior to the presentation of the bill in 2017, the government was, whether on purpose or not, making it harder for parents to act in the best interests of their children when considering home education at short notice. Although the government insists that the decision to remove a child from school and into home education is not a snap judgment decision, we have heard stories of at least one mother who felt it necessary to withdraw her child overnight from an ACT school, and provisional registration allowed her to do so in a lawful fashion. What followed was a period of 3 months in which this parent could prepare an education plan and then proceed to apply for full registration. What also became clear was the government had not nearly done enough to gain the trust of home educators in the ACT, and we can all understand the parents' concern. It is most important to recognise that many parents choose home education for their child as the best option for education. However, some are driven to it as an option of last resort, and this comes out of a failure of the education system to cater for their child's needs. The bill in its original form would not have only have put every application at the mercy of the Director-General's discretion, but also had an uncertain time frame in which their application could be granted, and we all know how long bureaucratic timeframes tend to blow out. The idea of introducing discretion to grant registration would, in their minds, allow an opportunity for the government to willfully and conspicuously deny home educators the chance to remove their child from school or drag out the time it takes to register. It has taken almost 2 years and significant consultation with the community for the government to reach even this point in the legislative process. Now, we in this chamber all understand the rules of administrative decision-making and that the government is bound by them. But that a truly capricious decision is cause for appeal. But it does beg the question, why are so many parents so concerned that they will be the victim of such poor decisions that they may be forced to appeal? And of course, if they are required to do so, the time, resources and money it takes to undertake that process in itself is not an ideal outcome. Citing the government amendments that the Minister is putting forward, what was once a very short and simple bill has had a number of amendments which we know have come as a direct result of the opposition's advocacy after consulting at length with the home education community. Although the government has been unwilling to move on the idea of abolishing provisional registration, there have been some advancements in a manner which we believe have reached middle ground. The government has introduced a timeframe within which the decision to grant home education registration must be made, and has also made the decision has also made the decision to it a must register provision if the Director-General is satisfied the terms of registration will be satisfied. These must make provisions are good in that it provides parents with certainty. The application up until the closure of the 28-day window is intended to qualify as a reasonable excuse for the child not attending school. However, after the opposition's consultation with the home education community, the Canberra Liberals have chosen to move an amendment to clarify this provision, and that will be moved in the detailed stage. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are disappointed that the government identified a significant flaw in the home education system, alerted the Chamber and Canberra community to the issue in the form of a poorly consulted piece of legislation, and then allowed the issue to go on unremedied for over 2 years. This has not only exposed the flaw to the public, but also exposed home educators to a prolonged and highly stressful period of indecision. Given the amendments being brought by the government to their own bill, and after much consultation with the home educators, the Canberra Liberals will be supporting the amended bill, but we will also be moving some minor amendments of our own. We accept that it is not desirable for children to be withdrawn from school into unsafe home education situations without some form of directorate oversight, and that is a safeguard that we believe is adequate. And putting this uncertainty to bed after 2 years is also a long overdue closure. Finally, I outline our understanding of the registration process which will be enacted by this bill, and to clarify that this is the precondition to the Canberra Liberals' support. Should a parent need to withdraw their child at short notice from a school due to, say, severe bullying or violence or another issue, the parent must complete an application form for home education and submit it to the Director-General of Education. This application must contain the information which is set out in the regulations attached at Schedule 1. This includes information about the child's name, the parents' names, and proof of parental responsibility, as well as the address where the child will be educated. The Directorate then has 28 days in which they must make a decision. If the Director-General is satisfied on the paperwork supplied that the conditions of registration will be complied with, the registration must be granted. During this 28-day window, the child will have a reasonable excuse for not attending school. The opposition's amendment to this bill, discussed into the detailed stage, further clarifies and makes abundantly clear that while an application is being assessed and considered by the Directorate, neither a student nor their parents will be at fault under any compulsory attendance provisions of the Education Act. Should the application be granted, the child will be registered for home education, but this registration is conditional upon providing the Directorate a full plan for the child's home education within the first 3 months of the registration period. There has been some confusion about this registration. Is it full registration or is it not? We have likened the grant to have a driver's licence. You have a full licence, but there are conditions upon it. But that is not to say that a licence itself is not granted in its entirety. This is an inelegant and curious route, but it does appear to be a solution that is acceptable to the major stakeholders, the government and the opposition. As such, the Canberra Liberals will be supporting the amendment bill and will continue to keep an eye on the application of the new system and structure to ensure that home educators and the children at the centre of this do not suffer, or worse, children are prevented from accessing home education if their schools fail to accommodate their educational needs. With that, I commend the bill.
The question is the bill be agreed to in principle. Mr Rattenbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the ACT Greens will be supporting this bill today, as well as the subsequent amendments to the original bill. For those of us who have been involved with this bill since it was first tabled in the Assembly, it is very positive to see it finally debated and brought forward with a strong degree of support across those who've taken an interest in it. I would like to acknowledge the more recent engagements my office has had with Minister Berry's staff and their willingness to look at some of the issues that have been identified with the original bill. I appreciate the considerable efforts of her office and the Minister herself over the past few months in seeking to find a way forward. Likewise, my staff have also had positive and productive discussions with Ms Lee's office, which has also been appreciated. The changes to the Education Act relate specifically to the provision of home education. These changes have been consulted on with a wide range of home educators in recent times, primarily parents who are currently educating their children in their own homes. And this is not a homogenous group of people. These parents and carers are as reflective of the general community as parents of children attending our local schools. There are many reasons people make the decision to educate their children at home or outside of school-based environments, but I would say that for the vast majority of them, the best interest of their children is the essential commonality. And certainly in the conversations I've had with home educators, that shines through very strongly, a passion for getting the best outcome for their child and meeting the specific needs of their children, but also ensuring a high quality and interesting education. But of course, today's debate is not in fact about the why of home education, but rather the how. The government is seeking to clarify the preconditions for registration for home education and strengthening legislation the requirements for that registration. However, through the recent genuine consultation with local parents and their supporters in the home education community, the government has improved on this to also enhance the transparency of the Education Directorate's processes and allowed for greater certainty for current and future home educators. These are good outcomes because whilst compared to the number of students in the government system, the number being home educated is relatively small, it is an important part of our education spectrum, and therefore it is essential that we get this right, and that we have really clear processes, that we do have certainty, and that we give those parents who are choosing to educate their children at home confidence that they have a fair and obvious system to work in, and that their line of communication with the Directorate is clear and that expectations are clear. So I think this bill has, in its current form, gone a long way to actually addressing some of those sort of considerations that we would expect to have in this system. So, Madam Speaker, Deputy Speaker, in brief, the Greens are supportive of this final set of amendments, and I do particularly want to take this opportunity to thank the home education community for their patience, their persistence, and their willingness to constructively engage in the, at times, complicated task of amending legislation. It is often joked in this place that, doing legislation in these parliamentary processes is like seeing sausages made, and most people don't want to know how that happens. These parents have played a really constructive role. They've certainly taught myself and my office some things about home education that we didn't know, but they have overall made a very significant contribution in helping this legislation be what it is today, and I thank them for that contribution.
The question is the bill be agreed to in principle. Ms Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I table a revised explanatory statement to the bill. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I welcome debate on the Education Amendment Bill 2017 and the government amendments that I will move in detailed debate. Through the bill and the government's amendments, the government will strengthen the regulatory framework for home education of children. The bill strikes a careful balance between the right of the parent to choose home education for their children and the responsibility of the government on behalf of the community to look out for the rights of well-being of children and young people. While there are relatively few children in the ACT whose parents choose to home educate, a little over 300, it is regardless important that there is a robust framework in place to make sure that these children receive a high-quality education. The ACT community has a justifiable interest in ensuring that parental decisions about child education still result in a minimum education standard. There is also an obligation on the government to consider how it looks out for the well-being of children removed from the protective view of their key point of community contact outside the home, being a school. As was intended when it was presented, the regulatory framework to be established by the bill is detailed through the regulations. Over the time leading to debate, the government has engaged in extensive consultation about procedural elements of home education registration and has developed regulations for this purpose. Following in principle debate, I will move amendments that will insert the regulations as a schedule to the bill. The government is doing this to ensure its intended approach is clear before the Assembly considers whether to agree to the bill. The government amendments detail the single-step process for registering a child for home education. Registration will be granted on application after the parents of a child seeking registration for home education provide basic information such as that necessary to establish a child's identity and parental responsibility. The Director-General must decide on an application within 28 days of receipt of a complete application. By way of condition on registration, the parents of a child registered for home education must, within 3 months of registration, supply further detailed information about how they will provide a high-quality education and meet the learning needs of the child, and meet with a government official to discuss the home education of a child. If these conditions are not met, then the government may initiate regulatory action that may ultimately lead to cancellation of the registration. Following second and subsequent periods of registration, parents must meet these two requirements within 10 school days. Consultation with stakeholders highlighted that a key concern is the amount of time required for parents to prepare and provide education materials and a statement of intent to the Director-General. With the removal of provisional registration, a 6-month period, parents raised concerns that they would not have sufficient time at registration to develop their education statement of intent, detailing how they would educate their child and meet the conditions of registration. The bill would particularly affect parents who made the choice to home educate their child on short notice due to wellbeing or educational concerns. The government amendments provide a 3-month period for parents with new registrations to learn how to teach their child, collect materials and programs, and produce their statement of intent before these materials must be provided to the Director-General. It's also a time for parents to learn themselves how to teach their children. This period is intended to operate like a shortened provisional period for parents of new registration. It effectively creates a grace period of 3 months to allow parents to establish their approach to home education before meeting with an authorised person and providing their written statement of intent as outlined in the regulations. It also recognises that parents may have an evolving plan as they learn how to best educate their child, particularly where the child has complex needs. Across Australia, there are a variety of legislative solutions and timeframes for resolving this issue, all of which are more onerous than proposed by the ACT government. New South Wales, for instance, requires a plan aligned with the Australian curriculum to be submitted on application, but allows 90 days for it to be assessed. Queensland doesn't require an education plan at application, but must be submitted within 60 days. In taking this approach, the government's also acknowledging feedback that for some children with health or wellbeing needs, this early stage of home education might be focused on settling and preparing to re-engage in learning. The Directorate will engage and support these parents as much as required and requested during this initial period to produce an education plan in the best interests of that individual child. Perhaps there are other ways to achieve a middle ground on provisional registration. The government certainly examined other options, such as discretionary provisional registration, reducing the overall time of provisional registration, or adding conditions to provisional registration. These options all result in a framework that is no less complex or involve duplication of effort for both parents and the Directorate, and were discounted. The government's amendments through the regulations also make clear the expectations on parents for their educational plan. The government and the community have an interest in ensuring that the education of children is appropriate and still results in minimum education standards. I acknowledge that parents are passionate, committed and provide excellent educational opportunities to their children. Parents do have a right to choose home education for their child. The government supports this choice, and the bill also does nothing to undermine flexibility available to home educations in their approach to home education. Again, the bill is modest in this regard when compared to other jurisdictions, where, for example, parents must align their educational plan to the Australian curriculum or legislated learning areas. Two other important changes in the government's amendments arising from feedback during consultation is a new requirement on the Director-General to make a decision on an application for home education registration within 28 days, and the clarification that the Director-General has no discretion outside of the legislative framework to refuse an application. While it's important that home education registration still involves an active consideration of an application and discretion about whether the conditions of registration will be complied with, the government is providing reassurance through the government amendments that these are the only matters that are relevant. The government has taken the opportunity through the bill and the government's amendments to allow the Director-General to make guidelines for home education. During consultation, some parents raised that they felt unsure about the Education Directorate's expectations of them related to things like home education reports or how to document their education approach. I also saw it as useful that greater clarity and certainty of expectations about home base for home education, for example, be available. Guidelines issued by the Director-General are a convenient way to support home education parents in this area, and the Director-General has already begun developing them. In concluding in principle debate on the bill, I would like to acknowledge the commitment and dedication of parents who home educate. Their investment and sacrifice in doing what they consider is right for their child's learning and development should never be underestimated. I also extend my thanks to the representative associations and parents that provided detailed and useful feedback on the bill, regulation and draft government amendments. The government amendments I will shortly move are the result of extensive consultation with community stakeholders. The number of parents who home educate is relatively small, but among them are quite broad views and a desire that they be heard individually. I acknowledge the really positive engagement between my office and the offices of Mr Rattenbury and Ms Lee in bringing parent views together. I'd like to thank those members and their staff for their constructive approach to working with my office to reach an agreed position on the bill that accommodates the concerns of the community and still results in a robust framework. I commend the bill to the Assembly.
The question is the bill be agreed to in principle. Those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question, is it the wish of the Assembly to dispense with the detail stage? Is it the wish of the Assembly to take the bill as a whole? The question is the bill as a whole be agreed to. Ms Berry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Pursuant to Standing Order 182A(b), I seek leave to move amendments numbers 1 to 15 circulated in my name together.
Is leave granted? Actually, is that quite... Sorry, that's not quite what my script says. If I got the right script. There was something about Amendment 11.
No, I'm just doing one
Okay,
to 15.
rightio. Okay, just... Okay. Is leave granted? Sorry, leave is granted. Ms Berry. You have to now move it.
Yep. I move amendments numbers 1 to 15 circulated in my name together. I've tabled the supplementary explanatory statement to the amendments.
The question is that Ms Berry's amendments numbers 1 to 15 be agreed to. Are you speaking, Ms Berry?
Are you going to speak, sorry? Are you speaking?
On the amendments?
Yes.
1 to 15.
Oh, yeah.
Are you
Yes.
speaking?
Okay, sorry.
Okay. The question is that Ms Berry's amendments be agreed to. Ms Berry.
Thank you. The government's amendments make some relatively minor changes to the bill. Amendments 1 to 3 of the government amendments to the bill address technical drafting and machinery matters. Amendments 5 inserts definitions for the terms home education report and new registration, which are adopted for simplicity of drafting. Amendment 6 inserts a note that draws attention to decisions about home education registration that are reviewable. Some stakeholders raised that this would assist them when reading the Act. Amendments 7 and 13 omit the definition of home education from Chapter 5 and relocate it to the dictionary to the Act. Amendment 14 inserts signpost definitions for the terms home education report and new registration into the dictionary. The government amendments also set out in detail the regulatory framework for home education. Key is Amendment 15, which inserts into the bill amendments to the Education Regulation 2005. The regulations will detail the process for home education registration and particularise requirements related to the Home Education Register and home education reports. As I described during in-principle debate, supported by other government amendments, the regulations will set out a single-step registration process but provide a 3-month grace period for the first consecutive instance where a child is registered for home education, referred to as new registration. For a new registration, parents do not need to demonstrate compliance with conditions of the registration related to providing a high-quality education and meeting the learning needs of a child. It's also appropriate, given the relatively substantial detail required in drafting, that the framework rests in regulations rather than in the principal legislation. Amendment 8 makes clear that the Director-General does not have discretion to refuse to register a child for home education if satisfied that the conditions for registration will be complied with. It achieves this by replacing the word may in current section 131(3) with the word must. It is a small but important change to give confidence to the home educating community that the government cannot arbitrarily prevent parents from choosing home education, but rather can only do so based on legislated conditions. Amendment 11 mirrors Amendments 8 in clarifying that the Director-General has limited discretion when deciding on an application in this case for renewal of a home education registration. Amendment 9 supports the single-step registration process by allowing the government to inspect programs, materials and other records for use in the child's home education, except in the case of a new registration where parents may not have yet developed these items. Importantly, Amendment 9 also requires the Director-General to make a decision on an application for home education registration on one way or the other within 28 days of receiving a completed application that includes all of the particulars required by the Education Act and the regulations. This amendment is being made in response to feedback during consultation to provide parents with confidence that applications will not be ignored or unreasonably delayed. Appropriately, the recourse available to parents should the Director-General not comply with this requirement is through administrative law. Amendment 10 expands on the conditions of registration for home education included in the bill by inserting conditions requiring parents of a child registered for home education to submit a home education report, the home base for a child's education to be suitable for the education of the child. The requirement to submit a home education report is already included in the Education Act, section 138. By inserting this requirement as a condition of a registration, the government will be better equipped to monitor the quality of home education of a child because as a condition of failure to submit a report will allow the Director-General to cancel a home education registration. During consultation, one stakeholder, Mr Attenbury on behalf of the Greens, raised concerns that the current Act and Bill overlook the need to set a minimum standard for the home base for home education of a child. After a number of iterations, the government amendments settle on a relatively general condition about the suitability of a home base. The government intends to prepare guidelines that will assist parents to understand the government's expectations in relation to apply this condition, particularly in more novel circumstances such as when a family is on extended travel and moving from place to place. Amendment 10 also supports the grace period for new registrations by delaying for 3 months any requirement for parents to comply with conditions of registration relating to providing a high-quality education and meeting the learning needs of the child. Amendment 12 clarifies the obligations of parents in the submission of a home education report to the Director-General. Parents must submit a home education report by a deadline once every year, and reports must comply with any prescribed requirement. Amendment 4 inserts a new provision under which the Director-General may make guidelines. The government intends that the guidelines for home education issued by the Director-General will assist home educating parents to have greater certainty and clarity about the government's expectations of them. In summary, the government's amendments establish a framework that strikes a balance between the right of parents to choose home education for their children and the responsibility of the government on behalf of the community to look out for the well-being of children. I welcome the Assembly's support of the government amendments.
The question is that Ms Berry's amendments 1 to 15 be agreed to. Mr Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I seek leave to move amendment number 1 circulated in Ms Lee's name.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. Mr Wall.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I move amendment number 1 circulated in Ms Lee's name to Ms Berry's amendment number 9.
The question is that Mr Wall's amendment be agreed to. Mr Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This amendment to the bill is relatively self-explanatory and makes it clear that the period between receiving the application for home education registration until a decision is made by the Director-General and that decision communicated to the parents, children and parents will be exempted from any penalties for not attending school. This amendment clarifies and makes abundantly clear a significant concern within the community that the bill, as drafted, may restrict the options of parents to have their child removed from their existing educational setting at short notice. Ms Lee's office has had discussions with the Minister's office and Mr Rattenbury's office on this matter, and we've had this amendment drafted to ensure that we bring the home education community along with us on what are some significant changes to the legislation they operate under, and also remove any ambiguity in the interpretation and application of this new provision in the legislation. Before I conclude my remarks, may I just, on behalf of Ms Lee, her office, and also on behalf of my office and myself, when I had the portfolio back in 2017, convey my thanks to both those who have turned up in the gallery today to see the passage of this legislation, but also the many more in the community who have played a significant role in making sure that this legislation arrived at the best solution possible for those who choose home education as an option for their children. And with that, I will commend my amendment to the Assembly.
The question is that Mr Wall's amendment number 1 to Ms Berry's amendment number 9 be agreed to.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
Mr Rattenbury.
Thank you. The Greens will be supporting the amendment moved by Mr Wall today. We believe that subsection 6 of it makes it crystal clear that students and parents do not fall foul of the Education Act's compulsory engagement with education while awaiting a response from the Directorate, and the new clause 131(7) places a positive burden on the Director-General to make a decision to accept or reject an application within 28 days of receipt. We are happy to support both of these items, and while I'm on my feet, I think it's implicit from my earlier comments, but I'll also indicate our support for the range of amendments that have been moved by Ms Berry.
The question is that Mr Wall's amendment number 1 to Ms Berry's amendment number 9 be agreed to. Ms Berry.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The government will support, Deputy Speaker, the government will support Ms Lee's amendment to government amendment number 9. The Education Act establishes a compulsory education requirement that puts an onus on parents to make sure that their children are enrolled in and attend and participate in school education or are registered for home education. During consultation, parents raised concerns that they could be open to prosecution if they remove their children from school education while waiting for a decision on an application for home education. After receiving this concern, the government sought and received advice indicating that the existing provisions of the Act that create offences related to a compulsory education already provide parents with protection from prosecution under these circumstances. The relevant offences do not apply where a child's parents have a reasonable excuse. This term is broadly framed. The time period and process required to reach the point of an offence being committed are also unlikely to be met before the end of the 28 days within which the Director-General is required to decide on an application for home education. Madam Deputy Speaker, however, Ms Lee's amendment provides express clarity on this point, and the government will support that amendment.
The question is that Mr Wall's amendment number 1 to Ms Berry's amendment number 9 be agreed to. Please don't make me say that again. Those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question now is that Ms Berry's amendments 1 to 15 as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The question is the bill as a whole as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. Pardon? Oh, sorry. The question is the bill as a whole be agreed to. Sorry, the bill as amended be agreed to. Sorry. The question is the bill as amended be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The clerk.
Executive Business Order of the Day number 3, Building and Construction Legislation Amendment Bill 2009.